Keep in touch with the Wolf Connection Podcast on our Instagram handle at the Wolf Connection Pod, or email us your questions, comments, and guest ideas to podcast@wolfconnection.org. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection Podcast. I'm your host, John Kalfa. Very grateful that this individual reached out to us again on Instagram, and this is becoming more of a regular occurrence. And before we start this again, just want to thank everybody who's been listening to the podcast, who's been emailing us, who's been reaching out to us. Me and Steven absolutely love this, and this is the best part about this community is that you guys are giving us guests, you're bringing yourselves to the forefront, and we just have more information and more stories and more things to share with everybody who's listening to this podcast. So again, cannot thank you enough. And that's a preface to our guest with us today. She was formerly the lead of wolf policy for the Department of Fish and Wildlife in Washington State for 2 years. Before that, she was the wolf coordinator in there. And now she is the Endangered Species Recovery Manager, currently for 6 months. So brand new for her, but she's been in the space for a while. And that is Julia Smith. Julia, it is wonderful to meet you and great that we get this going on. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me on. It's great to speak with you both.
Thank you.
Yeah. And thanks for talking about this because we've spoken about Washington State wolves for a little bit and really trying to get into the Pacific Northwest as we talk about British Columbia and Alberta and things with John Marriott and everything going on up there. So there's a lot of wolf news and things to happen. So before we get into policy and just your your dealings with Washington wolves, and you're still dealing with that, just give everybody your background. Where did you grow up? Are you a Washingtonian by trade? Did you move there? How did this passion for wildlife begin for you?
Yeah, thanks. So I am not from Washington. I'm from the Midwest. I grew up in Indianapolis. I'm a city girl. And, part of what comes with growing up in the city and growing up in the Midwest is the absence of large carnivores like wolves and other critters like bears and cougars and things like that. And so I can't really explain to you where the fascination with wildlife came from. It feels like I was born with it. But when I was young, I was looking for things like deer, raccoons, even things like goldfish in ponds on the local university campus. I mean, that's how sort of starved for wildlife we can get in the city. Of course, I know so much more now about, how abundant wildlife can be in urban settings. But back then I wasn't aware of any of that. And so I became really, really fascinated with critters that no longer existed where they used to. And notably, large carnivores are absent from a very large portion of their range in the eastern United States. So Indiana is at the center of a part of the country that doesn't have breeding populations of large carnivores like bears, cougars, and wolves. So you have Iowa and Indiana and Illinois. You've got some wolves to the north. You've got some bears to the south. You've got cougars to the west, but they don't exist there in the heartland of the United States. And I think that's what sparked a curiosity is where did those animals go? What happened to them? Why don't they live here anymore?
And so when you're looking at the history aspect of it, does that then formulate your feelings about, I want to get into conservation, I want to get into policy, I want to figure out how to help these critters especially of the big apex predator variety, reestablish their populations? Was that something for you? Like, did wolves get on your radar after doing research, after looking into all these things about having the absence of them there? How did that all come about for you?
Yeah, for me, it was never specifically about wolves. I didn't really grow up with a wolf obsession like many folks, even though, of course, there's good reasons for that. My favorite animal from when I was a young child was the mountain lion, in particular. But it was really all endangered species. I was thinking about, again, species that had disappeared and was it possible for them to come back? And so when I initially was starting to be interested in wildlife, I was thinking about endangered species. But for me at the time as a city kid, to me, that meant the zoo and the work that the zoos were doing for endangered species conservation. There are a lot of captive rearing and reintroduction programs that start in zoos. And a lot of that work is overseas, where they might do captive rearing of wildlife for other countries and even continents. But I wasn't fully aware of a lot of the efforts that were going on in the United States when I was young. But when I was a young child, I was a volunteer at the Indianapolis Zoo, and I worked on things like African lion, African wild dog, some of these other critters that are part of what were called at the time species survival programs. And those programs are who maintains the stud book, meaning the genetics in captivity and who breeds with who, so that we can maintain genetic diversity of these imperiled wildlife populations. That's what I knew at the time. Of course, when I was young, I didn't realize that there was an SSP, or a species survival program, for Mexican wolves, for red wolves. And, that would all come later as this path unfolded for me.
Yeah, I was reading up a little bit on your bio, and in some of the articles that I found, that Arizona Fish and Game, I think, was one of your first stops. And so you worked with Mexican gray wolves for a minute. It's interesting because the more people we speak to, you find more individuals like Stephen and I from the East Coast, from the Midwest. Everybody kind of just makes their way slowly but surely out west to help these populations or to work with them in some capacity. It's really fascinating to see, like you say, the draw and the allure of the absence of these critters, and then you want to be as close as you can possibly, and not in a zoo setting, as you were saying. So as you make your way westward, what was that first experience when you're in Arizona Fish and Game? You're working around Mexican gray wolves in that specific population.
Yeah, that my experience with Arizona Game and Fish was so eye-opening. I will go back a little bit and to say that I did my master's on large carnivore recolonization in the Midwest. So my master's thesis work was about the possibility of cougars, bears, and wolves coming back to the Midwest, and is there habitat to sustain breeding populations? Is there what would the attitudes of the people who live there be like about these large carnivores? So that's what I studied in Illinois, of all places, that is sort of at the center and surrounded by breeding populations in other states, and had individual large carnivores dispersing through, but didn't have breeding populations. So then my first job out of my master's was an intern with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on the Mexican Wolf Project. And at that time, I was working in Arizona, New Mexico. So my knowledge at that time was really academic. It was from reading about it and hearing about it. But, there's a big difference between reading about what we call the working landscape, the landscape that's shared by wildlife, that's shared by people, that's shared by recreationists, that's shared by people for all kinds of uses. It's one thing to read about it, and it's one thing to live there. So if you can imagine somebody who'd never been west of the Rockies before, and totally Midwest born and bred, driving out to Arizona, finding myself in Alpine, Arizona, this tiny, tiny rural town at the heart of the Apache Sitgreaves and Gila National Forests, at the heart of Mexican wolf recovery, where most people do not support the reintroduction of Mexican wolves. And so I would say I was greatly humbled by that experience. You come in thinking that you have this sort of knowledge, and you can come in with solutions. And at the time, I would have said to educate people, which I would never use that phrase anymore. It's an offensive phrase. It's a disrespectful phrase. So that experience was so grounding. I was educated. I was humbled by wolves and people in that place.
So you mentioned that all of this effort is kind of, in some way, it has to do with the curiosity about these animals, these species that are close to the brink of extinction, or the populations are really hurting, and you have this curiosity about whether they can come back, whether they can be viable again. And I'm curious, what's your, the saying is, right, what's your why, right? So why do you think why do you personally feel like it's important to try to bring these types of species back from the brink? Why not just let them go extinct?
I think that, so I'll quote Aldo Leopold here. The first rule of tinkering is to keep every cog. So that's more of the like scientific answer, is that Aldo Leopold and many, many other scientists, of course, would have thought that, biodiversity is about the full suite of native species in an ecosystem. You don't just take one piece and throw it away and think that everything is going to be fine. And it's not just wolves, but with a species like the wolf, you can't just take that species out of an ecosystem and throw it away and think that, everything will function the way it did and everything will be fine. Our ecosystems are incredibly altered. They're vastly, vastly altered from what they were pre-settlement, one could say pre-European settlement. But I do think that our responsibility as, stewards of this planet is to do this is just my own personal belief. The right thing is to restore wildlife populations. The right thing is to do everything we can to help wildlife stay on this planet. We will never get them back to the way that they were in the 1800s or at a certain time. Recovery doesn't look like what it did even 50 years ago or 100 years ago. But what we can do for wildlife, we should do for wildlife. And I guess my simple answer is because it's the right thing to do, is not to allow other species to suffer as a result of humanity. We need to live we need to live with wildlife, and it's not in coexistence always. It's not in harmony always. It's messy. It's difficult. But, what kind of species would we be when we are driving all of these other species and populations to extirpation or to extinction? To me, it's the right thing to do. And there's sort of a visceral fascination with this that I can't completely explain, but I have always felt that we are supposed to keep these critters on the planet.
Yeah. And we're noticing that the importance of biodiversity, or the idea of biodiversity, is definitely coming up a lot more often lately. It feels like a very important thing to hammer in. And so we're going to, at least I'm going to try to use you here as a way to do that. Because in a lot of spaces, it doesn't come up enough, particularly where we're focused on more short-term goals and very individual goals or group-centric goals. So can you just give us your thoughts on why it's so important for us to think in terms of having as close to the full host of native wildlife as we can, and sort of why this idea of biodiversity is really the overriding consideration if we're thinking long-term?
Think about a huge, huge spider web. That's really all any of this is a giant web. And sure, you could think of it as some kind of food web, but that's not really the metaphor that I'm trying to draw here. If you pull on any one thread, that web is going to change. It may bend. Hey, sure, maybe you just remove one thread and it's okay. But maybe you remove one thread and the whole thing shifts to one side or breaks or goes away. And we do not have enough information to know the consequences of the loss of species. We have some idea. I believe we've scratched the surface of an idea of what it means to lose species. And I do not just mean this in the way that species can serve human needs, although, of course, we rely on other species for so many human needs. But this whole system is built on millennia of evolution, the time scales that we can't even comprehend. And so we're in our current time and our very, very short lives, our 4,000 weeks on the planet. And we think that, oh, well, the disappearance of this frog or this fish or this snail or this plant is not a big deal. But it affects the whole web, it affects the whole system. And maybe we don't know now exactly what it means or what it does, but it's this downgrading, it's this conversion of our ecosystem that provides us everything we need to live, from clean air, clean water, food, medicine. everything that humans need is reliant on other species. And again, we can create a concrete world and think that that's going to provide us our needs. But I think every day that passes, we start to understand that that's not true, whether that's through the effects of climate change that we already see are happening, or whether it's something like the loss of pollinators that we see directly affecting the food sources that are so important to us. Biodiversity, it's this huge umbrella term, like you said, but it really is everything. I think it's hard for people to comprehend, though. How do you boil down that big term to what one species contributes? It's like a dot in a painting, but you need all those dots to make the whole painting.
Yeah, and my understanding is it's not just about these large species that we can see with our eyes, but there's like a micro world of biodiversity that is really important, that it's all these things we can't see that are kind of, they keep us ignorant to where we're at and to what's going on. But it's, I mean, all over the world, biodiversity is being challenged with like palm oil forests being, erected where there used to be jungles and rainforests and all these things. And it's like, it's not only that, but it's the access to a biodiversity in the context of food for all these species. And there's all these different mosses. And I mean, it's like you said, a spider web, but it's just a lot of the little connecting tissues are so impossible to even perceive. It's kind of like, it's overwhelming to a degree.
I would completely agree. And what you said about there's so much more of it we can't see. We tend to focus on these big charismatic critters like wolves, but there's so much more beyond that surface. And we don't know what we're doing to it with pesticides, with microplastics, with carbon emissions. We don't comprehend the extent to which we're affecting that which we can't see.
Yeah, and we're also, every time we do a laundry load, it's microplastic city.
That's right.
I mean, we just don't, I mean, how could we ever know what the effects of all this are going to be?
Right.
Yeah.
It's wild.
I mean, we were just talking about, I think the last episode we were talking about caribou and the permafrost that is disappearing for caribou. This is the thing to keep the caribou healthy, right? And it's things that we as a species will look at and say, oh, that's not such a huge deal. But the domino effect of just that simple, not even really simple, that major change, just on the permafrost side will cascade all the way down through the spider web. And like you said, it might not even just take a thread. It might just knock the whole thing right out.
That's
and
right.
It'll just impact everything.
Yes.
It's just wild to think about that stuff, about the biodiversity. I know this seems to be more, and we'll get to the wolf stuff in just a minute. It seems though, in this role for you as the Endangered Species Recovery Manager, are these the things that you are looking into? I don't want to say more, but you're really focusing on like what Stephen's saying, the things we can't see and the things that would impact, like you said, take the megafauna out of it, as we talk about, bears, cougars, all the things that people can actually see. Are you more, I wouldn't say interested, but are more focused on the stuff that people cannot see and the species that, like you said, the frogs, the snails, things like that are so intricately placed inside of each ecosystem?
Yeah. So I'm focused on not specifically the things we can't see, because I don't study things like soils and microbes and that sort of thing. That's another department. But I am focused on recovery efforts for other species that perhaps are lesser known or lesser loved. Everything from our reptiles and amphibians to our invertebrate species, to birds of all kinds, whether you're talking about vesper sparrows or sage grouse, so many birds in decline. Some of mammals that depend on habitats like the caribou that you just mentioned, Cascade red fox, lynx, wolverine, white-tailed ptarmigan, a bird, all these species that are dependent on alpine environments that are so rapidly changing. Yeah, so I'm focused on how do we foster recovery for those critters who have very specific needs. They aren't generalists. They're not necessarily adaptable or resilient to change. They're struggling to hang on.
Yeah. Man, it just, and again, when you speak these things as somebody who's in it all the time, it resonates. Does it resonate more when you have discussions, or when you, I don't know if you do public speaking, or if you, what's the way that you get sort of this information out? I know we're kind of going around a little bit, but it's, this is why we love this forum, because we can just talk about this stuff. What's the way, and how do you disseminate this information so that it's accessible to the public, accessible to people who, again, are not in the field all the time and understanding the effects of just the changing world around them, and getting out of there every day and noticing that, hey, this is a major factor of what's happening and how the world and the planet is changing?
Yeah, I think probably the most important thing about connecting with people, on top of just sharing information in a very honest way and with integrity, and hopefully in a way that even if you're presenting information that people don't like, that they can still hear you. So on top of that is just to be very respectful of where people are, where they're coming from, what their background is. They may or may not understand these issues as well. And so it's really important to connect people with what is most meaningful to them. Maybe they live in Seattle and have a container garden, and maybe we can talk about, hey, did you know that there's things you could do on your balcony that you might be good for pollinators or birds? Or maybe it's a private landowner with a huge amount of acreage or a huge ranch, and we can talk to that person about, hey, did you know that there are agreements we can enter into with folks like the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that help conserve endangered species and ensure that folks can still maintain private land without excessive regulation, but do good things for endangered species. There's all sorts of scales and levels. And many people don't know what's in their backyard. They may not know they have an endangered frog in their backyard, or an endangered butterfly, or a rare bird. And I think the more we can do to hopefully connect people and not alienate them, not think this is about taking away their autonomy or something like that, but sort of working in concert so that we can all do good things for disappearing species. And one of the things that I find is really accessible to people is everybody has a space that could be managed for wildlife. Everyone, no matter how big or small, a pot of flowers outside your door can do something good for wildlife.
When you're talking about this kind of stuff, it strikes me as so unfortunate that we've developed such a distrust, which probably has a lot to do, to be fair, probably has a lot to do with the political atmosphere in recent years. We just have a sense that someone is always trying to sort of pull the sheet over our eyes, and there's this thing beneath the thing that's nefarious. But to the point where, when someone is genuinely trying to help and has the information that could help, it's hard to implement solutions because we're just so reluctant to listen to genuine solutions if they challenge our understanding of our identity, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. And there's so much distrust in government. And I understand why. There's good reasons to not trust the government. Many people have lots of good reasons. So as a person who works for the government, I strive every day to be a person, who you can trust, whether you like the information that I'm sharing or not. I hope that you can at least say, well, she's trustworthy. She's bringing the best information that she can bring, and then I can make my own decision about it.
No, absolutely. And those are the things that we're lacking as a society, I think, just in general, because Stephen and I have gotten into this too, where the transparency level on anything is just so, it's gone out the window, in that people don't trust each other, don't trust governing bodies. And with the erosion of that trust comes the erosion of, like you said, being in concert with everything surrounding them. And so that if it doesn't affect the square box with which I inhabit, or it doesn't suit the needs or the beliefs in which I have, then therefore it doesn't matter. And therefore it's used as a weapon, or weaponized the other person or the other group or whatever it is, as opposed to saying, hey, how can we be working together to find these solutions and make globally change, not only just in our environment, but I think across personal and political lines. I think that's something that, boy, if we could ever mend that fence, then we would have a lot more ways to move forward in these ways. And I mean, I've said this a couple times before, in that the wolf issue is so politically driven and charged, and that if there was ever something or ever a species unfortunate to them in a way that the labels that have been placed on an animal, if that could ever be solved, that would go a long way with everything else. Because if you could recognize that species that is so put in a poster, put on whatever it is, and say, we fix this problem, then you could just be like, oh, well, fixing a stream, we can do that. We already did the other thing that nobody liked. So anyway, just getting into that. For you, when you were lead a wolf policy, and this is, I'm just bringing it full circle here. When you stepped into that, what were your feelings, I guess, going in, and how did things shift or change in learning about the wolf population, the politics around it, and the contention being in a state that actually houses a population of wolves, whereas so many of the lower 48 do not?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so much for me personally has changed as I transitioned from a person who studied wolves and large carnivores, coming back to places where they used to live from an academic standpoint, to actually living it. And it goes back a little bit to when I worked for Arizona Game and Fish. At that agency, I had my dream job. I was a biologist who was, studying wolves in the field, got to follow them around every day, collar them, know where they were going. I knew the wolf families very, very well. And you get to just peek into their lives and take a glimpse into what a wild animal is doing. And that's what I always wanted to do. So I had achieved that. But the part that was so hard is that on the ground biologists are not often decision makers. And so it was a very difficult space, a politically charged space, to not be a decision maker. And I felt, at the end of the day, I had to move into a space that would allow me to, maybe not be a decision maker, but at least have a seat at the table where I could hopefully influence policy. So when I came to Washington, that's why I came to Washington. I hope to influence wolf policy rather than just being the one who flies around in a helicopter and collars wolves. And Washington is a very different place from other places that I've lived, in that, I don't have to probably tell either of you, this state can be very divided politically. You have very, very strong voices, and I would call them probably equally strong voices east of the Cascades and west of the Cascades. And I'm simplifying there because, of course, not everybody feels the same way. But with the wolf debate or issue, I don't think I had experienced before strong voices from both perspectives, both a very strong pro-wolf perspective and a very strong, you can call it anti-wolf perspective. Back in Arizona, I was more used to living in a rural community with people who didn't, love wolves. And so I was more used to speaking with people who would come from that mindset. Although, of course, I worked with wolf advocates in Arizona, it was just less of a prominent voice, I think, at least where I lived in rural areas. Here in Washington, both sides can be so strong and so cruel to each other. And that piece is really difficult. Circling back to what we were talking about before, is that, we have to understand that the only way that we're ever going to make any progress here is to see each other as human beings, and to try to understand that even when our worldviews don't match, it doesn't mean the other person is a bad person, or even that their intent is bad, just that they're coming at it from a different angle, different base of knowledge. And that hit me in the face right when I got to Washington, saying, wow, this is, it's a hot thing, and in a way that you're not as exposed to, when I'm out in the field, when you're in Olympia, the state capital, and that's where people come to say their piece. You hear all of it.
When you're in it, and this is I believe what probably prompted you to message us and then want to come on. And we wanted to invite you on for this is that, we discussed Washington wolves before. And from your perspective, again, as a policy lead, as a policy coordinator and a manager now, from your perspective, where to share your side, how do you feel that the wolf population, if you can, in generalistic terms, how do you feel that the population is doing and surviving at this current moment? Do you think it's something that is trending in the right direction? Do you think that it's sort of status quo? Where does it sit for you being in that world specifically for 5 years and seeing everything sort of shift and change?
Yeah. So I think wolves in Washington are thriving. And I don't know that that's something that is always appealing on the news headlines because it's more appealing in the media. It's more splashy to say, such and such species on the way to extinction or extinction crisis or something like that. And that's the thing that I think is maybe the biggest misconception about wolves is that wolves are actually increasing across much of their range in the United States or stable. But in Washington, they're certainly increasing and have been for the past 15 years. So to me, that's the missed story is it's an incredible success story. We have biologists who work for the agency who worked here when there were no wolves in the state, 0. And then they were present at the first capture of the first known breeding wolves in the state. And they still work for the agency. And these people are just blown away by the amount of progress they've seen in such a short time. And I have to say, the amount of growth that we've seen in our wolf population in Washington, we'd kill to see that in other endangered species. We would love to see that. It's kind of unprecedented when it comes to an endangered species to have that level of success. But a lot of people don't paint it that way. And I just think from a biological perspective and a policy perspective, it's important to get that piece of the narrative right and realize that progress was not easily won. There's been a ton of fighting. There's been a ton of work on consensus building, peace building capacity. Where do we say that in wildlife issues where we're talking about peace building? So those folks who have been willing to come to the table are the reasons why we've had good compromises. Even compromise is a dirty word sometimes in the wolf policy community. And I think compromise is the only reason we have wolves here in the first place. We are, I don't know. I think Washington is doing the best job of any state that has wolves in the lower 48. And I'm incredibly proud that we have our wolf population, that it's increasing. The director of our agency has said he's excited to see wolves expand across their range. That's a rare thing.
So what do you credit that unusual level of success to in the state? But then while you're answering that, can you just tell us how our population's counted in the state?
Yeah, our population is counted through a minimum count method, which is similar to how other Rocky Mountain states and the wolves in the Southwest and also in the Western Great Lakes initially. Some of those states have moved away from those methods as their wolf populations have grown. But initially, as wolves were coming back in these states and being reintroduced, they'll do what's called a minimum count. So biologists will collect data, whether that's through ground observations, aerial observations, track observations, howling, trail camera photos, where you can get a minimum number of wolves. And you say, okay, we know based on track counts on X number of occasions, we know there are at least 5 wolves in this group. And then you literally add it up. And, that includes, we'll count single wolves and dispersers too. And so you're gathering a minimum count, meaning it's not a population estimate. It is a direct count of the known number of individuals. And we know that there are more individuals that occur. That's also how Arizona and New Mexico currently collect their data. And that's also how Idaho, Montana, Wyoming used to collect their data before their wolf populations grew in size. And then what was your other question? Apologies.
Just what do you credit Washington's success to?
Yeah, from a biological perspective, wolves are just set up very well in Washington in that they're very well connected to other wolf populations. They're connected to thousands of wolves in BC. They're connected in Canada. They're connected to thousands of wolves to the
Makes
east
sense.
in the Rocky Mountain population. So genetic bottlenecks that other populations face, like Mexican wolves and red wolves, they do not face those same issues. So
All right.
wolves have been able to reintroduce themselves, which is, in my opinion, the best way for it to happen. So there's no issues with genetic bottlenecks. There's no issues with lack of suitable habitat or prey. There's a lot of suitable habitat in Washington. We have good amount of public land, although we are the smallest Western state with the largest population. But even so, there's a good amount of habitat for wolves to live in, suitable or sufficient ungulate prey. So that's the biological side. From the policy perspective, they have been protected in the state since 1980. And even with that, although of course there are allows for removals in regard to livestock depredation, things like that, those levels of removal have been intentionally kept very, very low and with a tight hold on that. And so, and again, that is not easily won. That's something that came through people deciding to work together about what they would be willing to live with, people on all kinds of sides of the issue. And so wolves biologically are species that are adaptable, resilient, they can withstand high levels of mortality. And so it's one of those things where Washington has been able to keep that level of mortality really, really low. And that means we have to do things that address poaching. And I don't just mean the regulatory side. I mean actually working with people so that they don't poach our wolves. And then in addition, keeping livestock depredation low. And how we do that is because proactive non-lethal mitigation has been really well funded in the state and primarily funded through the state legislature general fund. And remember that the state legislature is comprised of individuals who come from all sides of the equation, who come from all sides of the perspectives. So when people think compromise is a dirty word, it's happening everywhere, and it's necessary to support efforts like this. We would not have our non-lethal tools funded if we didn't have both people who are supportive of wolves and people who are not supportive of wolves, understanding that that's really the best thing we can do to help mitigate livestock depredations and help make sure we keep our wolves alive on the landscape.
So, as I'm sure you know, in the Rockies, there's a lot of there's a lot going around about how wolves kind of decimate ungulate populations. They decimate major populations of large ungulates like elk and deer, and then they just move on to other spots. Is there kind of a similar fear in Washington, or how have the ungulate populations been affected over time with wolf populations expanding? And like you're saying, they're doing really well. Just in that world, what's going on there?
Yeah, so I think for sure that fear exists. It's very, very prominent. Whether we have biological evidence to say that there's evidence for that fear to be founded, I don't think we do. The state legislature also invested very heavily in the Washington State Predator Prey Project, which I know you had Dr. Taylor Gans on recently. So she's a much better authority on what's going on the ground than I am. But I believe from their research that they found is, of course, wolves change things on the landscape. They're going to have an impact. But it seems like they're having more behavioral impacts on where elk are spending their time, what time they're doing it, where cougars are spending their time, what time they're doing it. But as far as the overall levels that is actually affecting ungulate populations, I don't know that we have evidence to show anything like that. And remember that wolves, like other carnivores, but wolves live at pretty low densities. So you cannot just have an exponentially growing population of wolves that is going to then, really, really suppress that ungulate population. It's going to, wolves are territorial. They do fight and kill each other. And so that's one of those things where you might have a wolf pack. So let's say 5 wolves, maybe in Washington. Of course, they can get bigger than that, but over a 300 square mile area. It's not a lot of wolves over a very, very large area. And so, of course, we care about impacts and we monitor impacts. And I think that the state will continue to do so.
Yeah. So like you said, that you haven't found any really good, solid evidence to support that wolves are decimating ungulate populations. And I don't think any state has, which is obviously an interesting thing. Do you think the misconception about that is due or related to, like what you're saying, is that the behaviors of ungulates are probably changing very drastically, particularly where they move, how they migrate, what time of day they're active, whether they spend time in this canyon or this watershed or whatever they're doing. And those behaviors are certainly changing with a pack predator on the landscape, which is vastly different than a mountain lion or animals that hunt solo. Do you think that a lot of the misconception is because of that behavioral change? It looks virtually as if there are no more ungulates in certain spots to certain people, or is there some other reason why that kind of messaging really permeates the West, even though there is no evidence to defend it?
I think in many cases, so the ungulate behavior is part of it, but I think that in many cases, wolves are an easy culprit. And I mean that sort of for positive ecosystem effects and what we might call negative ones. People say, oh my gosh, you restored wolves and the rivers are better and it's all due to wolves. And I'm a big skeptic of that, as I am as a big skeptic of, well, you introduce wolves and the ungulates are all gone. What else has changed in the last 100 years? Look at Washington state alone and our incredible population growth. I think we have gone from something like 3 million people to 8 million in maybe the last 30 years. Washington state has changed so much in terms of human population growth. And again, climate change we've seen the effects of hotter fires and droughts, things like that. Ungulates are affected by so many things other than just wolves. Wolves are one piece of that web. So we can't just say, okay, well, all these other factors, it's just because of the wolves. I think, yes, wolves are always going to be part of the story. And people probably focus on wolves because it's well known. Wolves are not cryptic. Their kills are very open and obvious. And, people who have seen wolf-killed ungulates are going to say, oh my gosh, that might stick in their brain. It's very prominent. And, wolves were eliminated initially because, perceived that they are competitors for what we like to eat. But I think that perception about changing ungulate populations is real. I just think of the reasons why are not clear. And wolves are always easy to put in the center of everything.
They are so easy, man.
It's just they're the poster child for everything that's good or bad. Basically, it's crazy. It's crazy to say that, but it's true.
Do you know how many elk wolves are killing each year in Washington?
I don't know the answer to that. Again, I think the predator-prey work can answer that. I just published a paper not that long ago with my colleagues from Mexican Wolf on number of elk killed by Mexican wolves. And, the answer is a small pack will kill about, small meaning, let's say 4 wolves will kill about an elk a week. And, a larger pack, let's say 8 or more wolves will kill about 2 a week. And, people are going to add up those numbers and say, oh my gosh, it's this many. But what people don't realize is, okay, it's not just about the number killed. Wolves are major scavengers. So they're eating hunter gut piles. They're eating roadkill. Right. They're eating diseased. It's not just about, oh, this is all they kill. And a lot of the times these studies are about elk equivalents. So they're getting their calories from other things too, like small mammals, birds, and other ecosystems. They're going to eat things like beavers, turkeys, things like that.
They're just opportunistic hunters like anything else. I mean,
that's right.
We were the same when we figured out how to hunt, that
they're hungry.
We're hungry. We got to eat. We got to find something to eat.
That's right.
On the more personal, not personal meaning you, but personal meaning human side, in social tolerance is where I'm headed, I think, with this, is that if the science is stating X, why then Well, let me ask this first. Social tolerance wise, if you were to gauge, and again, this is not painting general brushes across. I know we say this every time. This is like our disclaimer. But if you were to look at social tolerance in Washington State for wolves specifically, where do they sit in this microcosm of just this state alone?
Yeah, social tolerance is a fuzzy term. And so I
Isn't
have a
it?
hard time
Yeah.
answering that question without saying, what is social tolerance? I think that most people in Washington, whether they love wolves or hate wolves, know that wolves are here to stay.
Right.
I hear very few, if any, folks say anymore, time to eradicate the wolves and, sort of putting their hands in their ears and pretending wolves aren't here. That's just not happening. People who live with wolves in the state know that they're here to stay. I also think that the people who live where wolves live in Washington know that they're going to have to work together with other people to come up with the best policies to support them and to support wolves. I think so. Is that social tolerance? I mean, I don't think in any way it means that they like wolves or support them being here. And I don't think that there's anything you or I can say to make people like wolves or want them around. But I think there's a lot we can do to show people that we care about them. We care
Right.
about them as humans and that we want their needs to be met and their voices to be heard. And we don't just want to spend one day in their community and then leave and act like we've done a good deed, that they're in it for the long haul. They are the people who actually live with wolves. And so we need to figure out ways to support them.
Right.
So that's why I have a hard time saying social tolerance. I mean, we're
Right.
never going to make people like wolves, but we can have people feel okay about living with wolves, I think.
And I think that's where I was heading more is, are those in Washington State, obviously you are those in Washington State moving towards that, like you said, more of a community-based feeling around coexistence? It's, and that's what I'm talking about. Like, and again, all these things are tricky to say and nobody can really know. But if we know that wolves are there to stay, there's policies there, they're growing, they have places to go, they have places to expand genetic diversity, the whole thing. It seems as though there are things in place to help those that are obviously living on the eastern side of the state where the majority of the wolves are, obviously, to coexist in a way that will help them get along to their degree of getting along with them. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, I think so, but I don't think it means that people who live with wolves in Washington are completely satisfied or feel like everything they want is there. I think people would still say there's major problems, whether they think that's in terms of maybe they think compensation isn't enough or it happens too slowly, or maybe support with non-lethal tools isn't enough, or maybe when there are problems, like wolves have still killed livestock even after non-lethal tools are used, that the state is too slow to remove depredating wolves, or that we don't remove enough wolves because we remove so few in this state. I think those complaints are still there and still real. And I think I think people are still upset about it, and wolves still continue to be a flashpoint. That being said, having not, only been in the state for 5.5 years, it does seem to be far better than how it was when wolves were closer to just arriving on the scene, 2011, 2012, 2013. Before there were more robust policies in place. I think things have vastly improved, but that was only 10 years ago. And so I think about, well, another 10 years will pass, and another 10 years after that, another 10 years after that. And you hope that wolves just become part of the landscape, like many of our other native wildlife. But for those who live in close quarters with wildlife, they can always be a flashpoint, whether you're talking about a turkey in the middle of Spokane, or you're talking about an elk eating a fruit crop, or you're talking about a wolf among livestock.
Right.
I think it's different for every Western state. maybe it's not, I don't know, but are there a lot of ranches experiencing a little depredation, or are there very disproportionate? Are there a few ranches experiencing a majority, a lion's share of the wolf conflict?
Well, so from a very broad scale,
Yeah.
wolf conflict in Washington is very, very low. You're talking, maybe 20 to 30 depredation events a year. I mean, it's incredibly low. Yeah. Most of the time, those depredations are limited to a few packs and a few operations. So it's a problem that can be acute in very, very limited areas, but it is not widespread, thankfully. 80% of our wolf packs year after year are not involved in any livestock depredation.
As we close out, because I know you only have a few minutes left, if we were to look, because you said you've been there 5.5 years. If we go, I always hate this in interviews when people do this, but I'll do it anyway, just for the sake of the question. 5.5 years down the road for you, and looking at zooming out from the state, do you see the trajectory staying the same in terms of refining policies, again, just always getting better? Because like you said, when you first got there, things were the way they were, and they're better now 5.5 in, or they're moving towards that. Do you see that as a consistent or a constant in Washington State? Is that we're always going to try and get better? We're always going to try and tweak. We're going to make sure that we do as much as we can? Because it doesn't seem like from any of the folks that we've spoken to, the very few in Washington, that this is it's a hotbed issue, but it is not like a Montana, Idaho, or Wyoming. It really seems completely different. Am I right on that?
I think Washington State isn't even comparable to Idaho, Montana, Wyoming. I mean, it's nowhere in the same ballpark, and I kind of think folks should not compare Washington State. We are fully in wolf conservation and recovery. We are not in the place of, we're hunting wolves, or we're looking at hunting them tomorrow, and we're looking to decrease or stabilize our wolf population. We are very deliberately trying to increase our wolf population and allow them to expand their range. So we are just in a different place. We're closer to California or Colorado than we are to Idaho and Montana and Wyoming. I do think that things will continue on the trajectory that it's been on, which is an increasing wolf population, more interfacing with the communities who live with wolves, more trying to serve those communities to serve wolves, and trying really, to bring people together and try to meet the needs of all folks. And it doesn't mean that we create a policy that everyone hates, and it also doesn't mean we create a policy that everyone's happy with. The best thing I think we can do at the end of the day is create policies that people can live with. And at the end of the day, we have to serve our wildlife, and we have to serve those people who live directly with wildlife. And Washington's committed to that. Our legislature is committed to that. Our state is committed to that. And we want wolves to thrive in our state. And we have 15 years of wolf increases to back that up. And so I'd love to see 15 more. And in fact, I'm excited to see what happens in the next 15 years with our wolf population.
Yeah, so are we. I mean, we got to make it out to Washington at some point.
Yeah.
Julia,
Get
my
out
last.
Here.
Yeah, well, no, we will. Absolutely. Last question for you is, when you hear the word wolf, what's the thing that comes to your mind?
Balance. Balance. Wolves have taught me everything I know about balance.
Wow. It's very powerful. Thank you for answering the questions, for being open and honest with us. I mean, it's always great. And thank you for reaching out. This has been a great conversation, and you're steering the ship in the right direction from what we can tell. So thank you, Julia Smith, for all you've done and all that you're going to do. I have no doubt that we have 5.5 more years of you. We're going to be in a good place, an even better place than we are now in Washington.
Shape. What a pleasure to speak with you both, and thank you for having me on.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Hal Steele out there, and we'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody. Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Please visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer.